March 1898, Tsavo, British East Africa. Over 100 men vanished, torn from their tents by two lions that hunted not for survival but for pleasure. Official records were altered. Journals went missing. What truth was so horrifying it had to be buried beneath imperial pride and African soil? The truth, as you will soon discover, lies hidden behind censored reports, missing journals, and a trail of bones stretching across the African wilderness. For those brave enough to confront history's darkest chapters, this channel is your sanctuary. Subscribe now and in the comments. Tell us, what state are you watching from? March 1898, Tsavo, British East Africa, in a stretch of sun-bleached wilderness where the earth ran red and the air vibrated with heat. A nightmare took root, one that would defy reason, shred official reports, and stain the imperial conquest with the blood of its own laborers. At the heart of it were two lions, not a pride, not a wandering rogue, but a pair working with eerie synchronization, hunting with intention, selecting their prey not from the herds of game animals that moved through Tsavo's thorny scrubland, but from the tents of men. These were not ordinary animals, and the deaths that followed would not be ordinary killings. The British Empire, with its steel rails and iron pride, had come to claim the land. But the land, it seemed, had other plans. The camps that stank of blood were temporary stations for laborers mostly Indian and African tasked with laying the so-called lunatic line, the railway meant to carve through Kenya and link Mombasa to Uganda. Thousands toiled under brutal conditions, fighting disease, dehydration, and the land itself. But nothing could have prepared them for what emerged from the wilderness. In the dead of night, with the fire pits still glowing and sentries still posted, the lions began to take men. Silently, repeatedly. Some were dragged from their tents screaming. Others were never heard from again. The bodies that were found bore the marks of something more than hunger. They were torn, scattered, and often partially devoured, as if the act of killing had been the true motive. Over the course of 9 months, these lions would allegedly kill more than 130 men. The official British tally, years later, would quietly settle on just 28. It should have been simple, a tragic case of predatory adaptation in a changing environment. But the details, those rarely published and nearly lost to time, tell a different story. The lions avoided traps that should have caught them. They dismantled barriers with something approaching strategy. They ignored livestock and camp refuse, favoring human flesh with unexplainable consistency. Witnesses spoke of their fearlessness, of lions walking through lines of fire, of eyes that glowed not with animal instinct, but with a calculating malice. These were not beasts, they were assassins, and they operated with a patience and intelligence that defied natural law. Decades later, in a forgotten military storehouse outside Nairobi, a rusted lockbox was discovered during a routine inventory sweep. Inside, beneath mold-eaten ledgers and yellowed supply orders, was the private journal of LTKOL, John Henry Patterson, the man who had led the railway project and eventually tracked and killed the lions himself. What he recorded within those pages did not match the official report he submitted to the Colonial Office. He wrote not of 28 deaths, but of 135. He spoke of missing persons whose names were scrubbed from rosters, of entire work crews that vanished, of frantic telegraphs to Nairobi that received no reply. He described a silence enforced not by the lions, but by imperial necessity. The project had to continue. The railway had to be completed. The truth had to be buried. What really happened in Tsavo, and why were the reports rewritten? But to understand the true horror, we must go back not just to 1898, but to the centuries-old rituals buried beneath Tsavo's red soil. The empire had always craved dominion, not merely over men and nations, but over nature itself. In the final years of the 19th century, this obsession took the shape of steel rails, driven through the heart of East Africa under a sky that seemed to waver with heat and judgment. The Kenya-Uganda Railway, later known in whispers as the Lunatic Line, was meant to be the artery through which Britain would pump its colonial ambitions inland. It promised commerce, civilization, and control, but what it extracted in return was blood. thousands of Indian laborers imported from British colonies across the Indian Ocean, and countless African porters, conscripted or coerced, died beneath the equatorial sun. Some from malaria, others from exhaustion, many from causes unrecorded. Yet in Tsavo, death would take on a new and more personal face. Tsavo was not a place made for man. It was a scorched realm of thorn, scrub, and red dust, where the horizon flickered under waves of heat and the wind carried the dry rattle of unseen things. There were no permanent settlements here, only the skeletal remains of ancient roots, forgotten altars, and the ghost sounds of war drums no longer beaten. The soil was hard, sun-baked, and clung to everything like ash. Swarms of tsetse flies danced in maddening clouds. At night, the silence was not comforting. It was a held breath, a dare. Into this wilderness stepped Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Patterson, an Irish Protestant of distinguished bearing and conflicted soul. Born in 1867 to a family of modest means, Patterson had clawed his way into the upper echelons of military engineering. He was a hunter, a builder, a man of science cloaked in religious restraint. To some, he embodied the empire's ideal, resourceful.com and unflinching. To others, especially those who read his private letters, he was something else entirely, a man, ill at ease with the savagery of his mission, and yet addicted to it. He came to Tsavo with a task, to build a railway bridge across the river. But what he found instead was resistance not from man, but from the land itself. Even before the killings began, the local tribes spoke in whispers. They told his Indian overseers that the land beyond the river was cursed. They refused to camp near the old termite mounds where, they claimed, spirits of the dead congregated. Stories were shared in hushed tones around fires of ghost lions, creatures that did not roar, did not eat antelope, and could not be tracked by any living hunter. Patterson, like any good servant of the crown, dismissed these tales as native superstition, useful for morale management, but irrelevant to the progress of empire. Still, the camp was uneasy. Supplies spoiled faster than expected. Workers vanished during the night, and their companions, terrified, claimed they'd simply run. Desertion, Patterson called it, cowardice. But then the bodies were found. At first, it was a single laborer, half buried in sand and stripped to the bone. Then another, his head, missing arms, snapped backward. The wounds were not clean. They were torn, yet deliberate. Patterson's journal entry from that week is brief, clinical, but the handwriting is noticeably more jagged. He began sleeping with his rifle beside him, but even he would soon admit they were never hunting alone. By April, the nightly silence of the Tsavo camps had transformed into a ritual of dread. Fires were kept burning in frantic circles. Stakes were driven deep into the ground, and men slept not in slumber, but in prayer. Still, each morning brought new absences, bedrolls left torn and blood-slick, footprints dragged into darkness, screams that had choked off mid. At first, the lions came in the margins, hunting at the edges of the encampment, where shadows blurred the boundaries between wilderness and man's domain. But within weeks, their boldness grew terrifying. They began entering tents, striding past armed guards and glowing fires with what survivors later described as arrogance. These were not attacks of desperation. They were performances, intentional, precise, measured. One man was taken while resting beneath a tree beside 3 others. None heard a sound. Another vanished while tending the fires. The coals were still hot when they found his boot, torn and filled with blood. Lt. Col. Patterson wrote with increasing agitation in his journal, his usual clipped, formal tone giving way to something more primal. They seemed possessed of a demon's cunning, never striking the same spot twice, always ahead of our movements as though they listened to our very thoughts. The officers, engineers, and foreman men trained to break land and tame rivers were left grasping at explanations. Some whispered of madness, of disease warping the lions' minds. Others blamed the corpses left unburied by the railway victims of disease. Heat stroke and exhaustion, their bodies cast into gullies or left exposed to scavengers. Had the lions acquired a taste for human flesh simply because it was easier prey? But this theory, too, began to crumble. Even with cattle and goats tethered in plain sight, the lions preferred men. Even when carcasses were left out to distract them, they ignored the offerings. Hunger was not the motive. Something else drove them. The colonial response was swift and embarrassingly futile. Boma's barriers of thorn and acacia were erected around sleeping quarters. The lions tore through them in silence. Elevated platforms were constructed for guards to fire from above. The lions never came close when a sentry was near. Steel traps were imported from Mombasa, baited with raw meat. They remained untouched. It wasn't just the lions' behavior that unsettled the men knit, was the sense that they were being outplayed. Even the African gunmen, veterans of skirmishes and seasoned trackers, refused to patrol at night. One, a Swahili named Mbaruku, offered a chilling explanation. "They are not animals," he told Patterson. Asterisk, "they are men. Shamans sent back from the dead for what we did to the old graves." That was when the laborers began to leave in droves. Indian workers packed what little they had and vanished into the scrub. African porters refused orders. Work on the railway halted. Telegraphs were sent to Nairobi, requesting military assistance. None came. The empire, in all its pride, had been brought to its knees not by war or rebellion, but by two creatures no man could explain or kill. In desperation, Patterson set the first real trap. A goat was tethered inside a steel enclosure, its bleating echoing through the still air like a funeral hymn. The trap was baited, cocked, and armed with tension enough to snap bone. And then they waited. But when the morning came, the goat was gone. The cage untouched, the trap still locked. The only evidence left behind, a circle of blood and two sets of paw, prints perfectly parallel, moving together, vanishing into the earth. It was on the 9th night of waiting that Patterson pulled the trigger. Hidden atop a makeshift platform built into the branches of a fever tree, his eyes straining through the iron sights of his rifle. He watched the lion move like smoke across the camps, edged silent, deliberate, uncaring. The bait goat below had long since gone hoarse, its bleats reduced to a rasping whimper. The trap cage remained untouched. But the lion did not need bait. It came as if summoned. At precisely 2 a.m., Patterson fired. The shot echoed like a cannon blast in the dead stillness, and the lion collapsed into the dust. What followed was not triumph. It was something closer to nausea. Patterson later wrote, asterisk, "I expected to feel relief. Instead, I felt watched." The first lion's body was examined in detail. It was large, muscular, and bore no visible signs of deformity. Its stomach was inexplicably empty. There were no remnants of human bone, no torn flesh, no signs of a recent kill. Even its teeth, initially believed to be broken or damaged, were intact. This should have closed the chapter. It didn't. The attacks continued. And the second lion, if it was possible, was more vicious than the first. Laborers were dragged from the very center of the camp, past armed guards and barriers reinforced twice over. The beast seemed fueled not by hunger but fury. One man was taken while hiding beneath an overturned supply cart. Another was torn from a tree branch 10 feet off the ground. In desperation, workers refused to return to their posts. The railway's progress froze entirely. The empire held its breath. In the quiet chaos of that final month, a series of documents long hidden, largely ignored, resurfaced. One was a letter from a missionary doctor named Thomas Greystoke, written in 1893, 5 years before the first confirmed attack. It was never published, never cited. The letter warned of increasing aggression in local lion populations near the Tsavo River following a mass death event. A plague outbreak, he wrote, had claimed dozens of lives in a poorly maintained settlement. The dead were left unburied. "I fear," he wrote, "we have nourished them with our own dead, and in doing so, changed them." His warnings were dismissed at the time as the ramblings of a man overcome by fever. Greystoke himself would die within weeks of sending the letter. The second revelation came from a recovered journal, fragment and signed, untranslated for nearly a century. It was found among a cache of colonial records marked for incineration in 1956, but miswild. The passage, allegedly written by an Indian laborer tasked with clearing a stretch of forest for the railway, describes the unearthing of an old burial site near the river. "Bones in chains," he wrote, "not buried, but hidden. We were told to dig and say nothing. That night, one of our men lit fire to the ground. The earth screamed. We had made a pact we did not understand. In blood we did not spill. Whether the account is true or not, it was quietly filed under irrelevant and buried in colonial archives." When Patterson finally killed the second lion weeks later, it took 9 bullets to bring the creature down. Its body was larger than the first, its hide marked with old scars. Its stomach, too, was empty. Not a trace of flesh, not a drop of blood. Yet the killings stopped. The empire resumed its march inland, and Patterson officially declared that 28 lives had been lost. But in his private journal, hidden away, then discovered in 1994 in a locked trunk by a Nairobi archivist, he wrote a different number, 135 at least. Many were never found, he claimed. Some had been taken whole, with no remains to count. What followed was quiet manipulation. The Colonial Office redacted large sections of his report. Eyewitness accounts vanished from public record. The Field Museum in Chicago would later acquire the lions' remains and reconstruct them, but even their taxidermied forms seemed too small, too ordinary for what they had done. But even death could not silence the man-eaters entirely. John Henry Patterson returned to Britain draped in the medals and accolades of a man who had faced the abyss and survived. To the public, he was the slayer of monsters, the engineer who conquered Tsavo, and the embodiment of imperial courage. The railway resumed. The bridge was completed. The empire, once brought to a halt by 2 predators, marched on. But Patterson himself would never again speak of Tsavo with certainty. In private letters, long ignored and scattered across the state archives, he confessed to restless nights. He claimed to hear the lions in his dreams, not as roars, but as footsteps. He described the sound of dry grass parting beneath paws, always just outside his tent, even decades after the last shot was fired. In one letter, dated 1921, he wrote simply, "I do not believe they were ever truly gone." The remains of the 2 lion-skinned, stuffed and reassembled with reverent precision, were eventually sold by Patterson to the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. There, they remain behind glass to this day. But something is wrong with them. Visitors often remark on their size, not monstrous at all, but smaller than expected, even gaunt. Museum staff later revealed the hides had to be stretched over smaller lion skeletons to make the mounts complete. The bones had deteriorated. The measurements didn't quite add up, and the more researchers studied them, the stranger they became. The first lion showed signs of healed abscesses in its jaw, painful, but not enough to prevent it from eating. The second had several molars missing, though these 2 had healed cleanly. Neither condition, scientists agreed, explained the total shift in diet, or the preference for killing beyond necessity. Multiple studies followed over the decades. Theories were proposed, then discarded. One suggested the lions had developed a pathological behavior due to environmental stress, overhunting, drought, and the easy availability of human corpses left unburied by disease. Another pointed to zoonotic diseases, brain infections, parasites, or trauma that could induce psychotic behavior. Some anthropologists speculated on deeper, darker causes, that ancient burial grounds disturbed by railway crews had unleashed a kind of ritualistic backlash, not supernatural perhaps, but cultural, symbolic, that the lions became avatars of a grief the empire refused to acknowledge. But no theory could explain the coordination, the intelligence, the precision with which the lions avoided traps and dismantled fences. Nor could they explain why the killings stopped so completely after the second lion's death, as if a contract had been fulfilled. What if, all along, the lions were not the origin of the horror, but merely its expression? What if the railway itself, slicing through centuries of sacred land and stories left unspoken, had awakened something that needed a voice? Something older than the railway, older than the empire, something that still watches from the acacia thickets and termite hills, waiting not to hunt but to remind. Was it madness, mutation, or something far darker, something the Empire was never willing to admit? Tell us, what do you believe waits beneath Tsavo's soil? For those drawn to forbidden histories and truths buried under blood and silence, this channel is your sanctuary. Like, comment, and subscribe, and in the comments, tell us, what state are you watching from?